Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, conferences, and other programs that foster dialogue on issues of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. The McFarland Center is also fortunate to be able to host an important lecture series, the Deitchman Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity, which is made possible by a gift from John Deitchman of the class of 1970 and his family. The Deitchman Lectures, as the name implies, helps us think about the ways that religion and modernity have been forces that work tenaciously to reshape each other in the modern world. What could be better as part of the series, then, to invite a speaker whose recent book is titled Catholic Modern. James Chappel's critically acclaimed Catholic Modern, The Challenge of Totalitarianism and the Remaking of the Church, right here, helps us to understand ways just how the international political crises of the 1930s pushed the Catholic Church to embrace the modern world, and how that legacy impacts us many years later in a postmodern setting. He is the Hunt Family Assistant Professor of History at Duke University, where he specializes in the intellectual history of modern Europe, focusing on themes of religion, welfare, and the family. He's published a number of research articles and book chapters and written review essays for The Nation, Dissent, and The Washington Post, among others. He's currently at work on a new project on the history of old age, tentatively titled End of Life, the History and Future of Old Age for a Graying World. Today he has a great story to tell about those events in the mid-century, how totalitarian European events caused a rethinking of the ideas that had dominated the Catholic Church for at least a century and a half before that. I'm eager to hear more, and please join me in welcoming James Chappel.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And is this now properly unmuted? Okay. Thanks so much for the introduction, and it is a huge honor to be here. So, I'm going to begin with two events that seem to be similar. Two moments when two popes in which progressive Catholics have placed a lot of hope kind of disappointed them. The first is Pope Paul VI, who we see here, Pope from 1963 to 78. Even if you're not an expert in history, you know this is sort of the global 60s. This is an era of tremendous change all over the world. And it's also inside the Catholic world, a moment when it seems like the church might accept contraception, start ordaining women, and become a leader in global anti-capitalist revolution. And again, you don't have to be a historian to know that those things did not exactly pan out. The most resounding blow here is Humanae Vitae. This is in 1968, an encyclical when Paul VI closes the door on contraception for Catholics. This inaugurates a new era of Catholic living in which millions of Catholics are openly flouting a core doctrine while still adhering to the church. So this is, I think, one moment when we think about a big shift in Catholicism. What looked like a door opening, which becomes a door closing. I think we might be able to see something similar with Pope Francis recently. He comes to office in 2013. As with Paul VI, lots of hope that this is the moment when the church is going to transform at last. The church is in turmoil, as we know, and some of you may or may not have followed this, but there's recently been a synod of bishops in Brazil where they're talking about crises of the church in Brazil, especially reaching indigenous communities. The synod had recommended some quite major transformations about sort of ordaining some married men, allowing women to become deacons, things like that. And as part of a moment when some churches, especially in the global north, are starting to push Francis on things like divorce or the Eucharist for divorced couples, things like this. Francis recently gives his response to this bishop synod in which he says a lot of nice things about, or the right things about climate change and respecting indigenous traditions and things like that. But when it comes to these core issues of sex and women, when it comes to ordaining some married men or allowing women to become ordained as deacons, he says, no, that's too far. And so I think this is actually two quite similar moments. I've seen a lot of people were very disappointed by this. I know some Catholics in Durham, some Catholic women who have sort of devoted themselves as women to saying, in my lifetime, I will be allowed to become a deacon. And they're just gutted by this. Just like in 1968, you can see so many women especially are gutted by Humanae Vitae, which seems to them like it's taking away their reproductive freedoms. So what we see here are two moments of reform that are foundering on the issue of sex. And it's not just here. If we think about the abuse crisis that's rocked the church in the past 3 decades, it's clear that issues of sex, gender, celibacy, homosexuality, and reproduction are at the heart now of what it means to be Catholic, and also might be at the heart of why a lot of people don't want to be Catholic. So the question I want to ask today is, how did we get here? How did it happen that the world's largest religious denomination came to be defined so squarely by this issue? And in a world where, at least to the secular eye, problems of things like mass incarceration, racial inequality, civil war, and climate change are maybe more pressing than something like gay marriage. Now, Catholics do have something to say about all of these things, of course, but nobody would say that, for instance, dogma about incarceration is central to the meaning of Catholicism in 2020, the way that sexuality is. There are dogmas about sexuality, and there are exhortations and recommendations about things like environmental devastation, usury, things like that. So, how did we get here? I'm going to be quite schematic about the nature of the talk here and remind you from time to time of where we are in the argument. I know this is pretty late in the day. We've all had a lot going on today. So I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I can. I'll probably talk for about 35 minutes or so, and hopefully there'll be time for discussion. This is mostly based on my book, but there's some stuff here that's not in the book as well. And because I'm trying to speak to, usually I speak to I'm trained as a historian. Usually I speak to other historians. We have these very boring cabals where we talk all about sort of methodology and lots of names and dates and things like that. I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum. But for the historians in here, I'll say that the talk you're about to hear is based on extensive archival research into the Catholic laity, especially in France, Germany, and Austria, focusing on priests, trade unionists, youth group leaders, and politicians, and using the methods of transnational intellectual history. For the rest of you, this is a talk about the Catholic Church. You don't need to worry about that. So, with that out of the way, the talk is going to have 5 parts. I'm going to start by talking about what I'm calling the church before sex, or before sex takes on the role that it does in the modern church. I'll talk about sex and the birth of modern Catholicism, mainly in the 1930s, when I think sex does come to take this role. I'll talk about a dissident strain of Catholicism, also in the 1930s, that did not want that to happen. I'll talk about family church in the Cold War in the early post-war decades, when I think the kind of sex-drenched kind of Catholicism kind of wins out and becomes the Catholicism we know today. And then I'll end with some concluding thoughts about what's happening now. Okay, so first we'll start with the church before sex. Now, of course, people were having sex in the early church, otherwise we would not be talking about a church at all. What I mean here is the church before issues of gender, sex, and reproduction became paramount. And in my view, this is actually most of the history of the church. The Gospels, those of you who know them, are not especially family-friendly documents. Jesus asks his followers to abandon family in his name. He is himself the product of unwed parents. And I don't think you can find this kind of sex focus much in the early church either. And if you read someone like Peter Brown, these kind of experts on the early church, they are very concerned with sexuality in the body. But it's not at all the kind of regulation, the kind of biopolitical regulation that we associate with 20th century Catholicism. It's much more about kind of the virtues of celibacy and sexual renunciation, things like that, than it is about regulating reproduction. And between the conversion of Constantine in 300 and the 20th century, this is the vast bulk of Catholic history, I think that sex was actually subsidiary to the church's broader efforts to conquer society by allying with the state. Now, it's easy to kind of parody this period. I mean, Catholics are committed to Augustine's doctrine of the 2 kingdoms, divine right kingship. People often think this is a Catholic thing. The divine right kingship is really a Protestant phenomenon. Catholics are not so into this. They're not so deluded as to think that anything like God's kingdom might appear on earth. At the same time, especially after the doctrine of Thomas Aquinas becomes central, Catholics came to believe that divine, natural, and human law were integrally related to one another. Not that they're the same, but that they should respect one another, and that the state is naturally bound to enforce the rules of the faith, which are also, in the Catholic view, the rules of reason. So one of the biggest findings in my research was that this kind of Catholic imaginary, the one in which Catholics are actually supposed to kind of conquer the public sphere and be closely intertwined with the state, lasts for a lot longer than we think. I think a lot of us are under the presumption, or the delusion, I certainly was, that there was this very kind of medievalist kind of Catholicism, 1,000 years ago or something, and that starting in maybe the 15th, 16th, 18th centuries, you slowly start to see transformation, and you slowly get to see a kind of Catholicism we're familiar with today, where Catholics of the Holy Cross aren't calling for, some kind of Catholic monarchy in the United States. To my knowledge, I just got here. But I'm pretty sure that this is not the what you all think is supposed to be happening. And what I actually discovered is that what we consider to be very obvious about contemporary Catholicism, that Catholics believe in human rights and religious freedom, and they don't want a Catholic state. They don't want a monarchy. They want civil rights for Jews, things like that. This is actually a pretty recent phenomenon, and it's not one that emerges kind of slowly over time, but one that I think emerges pretty quickly at one pretty specific time, which I'm going to say is going to be the 1930s. I'll argue that in a minute. But to set that up, I was really surprised myself when I went back to do the research that in the 19th century, the whole kind of century or 130, 40 years after the French Revolution, after the American Revolution, Catholics are still doctrinally committed to the old ideals of some kind of religious statehood, of a close intertwinement of the faith, the state, and the economy. And if you look at the easiest place to look at this is look at papal encyclicals, where the Pope is sort of laying out what he considers doctrine to be. And well into the late 19th century, it's still something like this. You can remember, this maybe shouldn't surprise us as much as it might. When we think about the 19th century, we often think about, railroads and communism and all these things that are really the avant-garde of history. But in most places, America included, the 19th century is still largely rural. You have not seen the introduction of consumer technology yet. In most places in Europe, where I'm talking about, this is still largely an era of kings and aristocracies, things like that. So it's all through the 19th century, it is not obvious that something like political modernity, defined by liberal democracy and human rights and things like that, is about to happen. Catholics still think with some plausibility, we can get that old settlement back. We can undo the French Revolution. So the 19th century church is not modern in the sense that it's not willing to accept kind of secular statehood. It's not willing to compromise with secular states or capitalist economies. And also, the 19th century church had not decided to put gender and the family at the center of its mission. That's the other kind of big finding I had in my research, was that if you sort of compare a Catholic newspaper or something from today, or even from 1980, to something from, say, 1880, the salience of issues of sex, gender, and reproduction is much greater in the last 50 years than it was through the whole of the 19th century. It just wasn't really the concern of Catholics at the time. They were concerned about it, right? I mean, there were articles and rules about divorce and abortion and masturbation, things like that. But it was in the context of a Catholic world in which they had rules about everything. They also had rules about the state. They also had rules about the economy. There wasn't a sense that this was the most important arena of Catholic jurisdiction. Okay. And so what I want to argue, I think there are two big changes that take place in the 20th century. One is that the Catholic Church becomes modern in the sense that the Catholic Church becomes what we talked about before, a church that's willing to give civil rights to Jews, that is open to religious freedom, that's open to secular states, things like that. And there's a turn to sex. There's a way in which sex, gender, and reproduction becomes central to the moral mission of the church. I think these both happen in the 20th century, and I think they're both pretty related to one another. So that is where we'll move now into a section on sex and the birth of modern Catholicism. Okay. Now, I'll be talking about a lot of things here that aren't going to be directly about sex, but you don't have to be a Freudian to recognize that sex is never just about sex. It's always about broader things. And the Catholic transition to sex is really a transformation in the understanding of what it means to be Catholic and the role of the church in a modern world. So I want to be a little more schematic here, because when people say modern, it can sound like, oh, that means so many different things. It's a kind of art, it's a kind of science, it's so many different things. But I think that when we're talking about Catholicism, the kind of modernity that was really important was this one. Basically a split between some kind of private sphere and some kind of public sphere. Catholics were always, despite what the stereotype might be, Catholics have generally been quite fine with railroads, medicine, industry, all these kind of things we associate with modernity. But what they have not been fine with, what they were afraid of, was what we would call religious freedom. The idea that the individual has the right to have his or her own religious beliefs, that the state is committed to neutrality in this regard. And so we have a situation in which everybody in this room could have different religious beliefs, and the goal of the state, of the United States, is to kind of protect and defend us all from each other and to ensure that no religion comes to dominate all the others. This is, in the end, what Catholics are really afraid of. I think we can understand why. I mean, in the sweep of world history, the modern idea that the state should remain indifferent to cosmological truths is kind of a strange one. And Catholics are squarely in the mainstream, if we think in the broad sweep of history, in thinking that this is a crazy idea and this will be some kind of disaster. So when I say that Catholics became modern, I want to say they came to accept a situation in which there's a split between private faith and public reason, between a private sphere in which religion can reside and a public sphere in which it can't. From this perspective, a society becomes modern once religion becomes private rather than public. This is the basic idea of religious freedom. So this sounds simple, right? But as we all know, it is not simple. There are so many ways to imagine and to navigate this split. To take an example, you can probably imagine examples from the United States. Think about school prayer, something like that. Taking a famous example from Europe. Should Muslim women be allowed to wear headscarves in public schools? Is that an expression of religious freedom? Oh, they're Muslims, they should be allowed to wear their traditional garb. Or is that an intrusion of religion into a secular space, the school? The other argument would be, no, this is supposed to be a religiously neutral space. If you bring in this aggressive display of religion, you are violating others' freedom. So the question, which is right? And I think it's unanswerable in the abstract. I think it's only answerable in specific contexts in which all the tensions of race, and to give that example, in which all the kind of tensions and histories of race, gender, and empire come into play. Now, for a lot of people, this means that the modern condition is built on a lie. Religions, they say, always deprivatizes, to use their term of art. It can never stay in the private sphere, so the modern condition is never here. It's not even really possible. But I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think the more interesting question isn't how religion deprivatizes, how it becomes public, but rather how it privatizes. How, in other words, do the faithful conceptualize the private sphere in which religion is meant to reside? Is the school private or public? And what kinds of public interventions does this authorize? In other words, what kinds of public activities of religion can be legitimated in the name of a particular understanding of the private? So I know that sounds really kind of abstract and heady, but let's think about it like this. And then maybe this makes it even more abstract and heady. But I came with a model kind of like this. And the idea is, if we're going to understand how a religious tradition becomes modern, we can first say, okay, how do they understand the private sphere? How do they understand or conceptualize this space that's allowed to be religious? And then we ask how that understanding authorizes certain ideas about what I take to be the three kind of major components of political economy, being social reproduction, economic production, and citizenship, or basically the family, the economy, and the state. How do certain ideas of the private authorize certain kinds of doctrines about these things? Because we all know the faithful have all sorts of views about all these things. And it's not that that's illegitimate. It's that this is coming from a particular understanding of what it means to be religious in a modern setting. Now, I'll go back to this. It's actually, for most of Catholic history, this doesn't make any sense. This is an irrelevant model, because they would not accept this idea that you can split the private and the public, that religion is supposed to be everywhere. To say it's only in one place doesn't make any sense. I think it's only around 1930 that you can start to see something like this become plausible and become thinkable. Even World War I doesn't matter to Catholics. I mean, it matters to Catholics a lot. I mean, a lot of them are killed. I mean, it does matter to them. But they're able to fit it into their old interpretive schema. They basically say, well, yeah, what do you expect? What do you expect if you get a bunch of societies that give up on the church? They're all going to slaughter each other. This is the way that Catholics are talking into the 1920s. But something happens in the 1930s that makes things different. It took me a very long time to realize this. I spent a number of years that I'm happy not to repeat, kind of trawling around these random Catholic archives and newspapers and journals and things like that, before it just kind of hit me that Catholic discourse in the 30s, let's say 1936, just looks totally different from Catholic discourse in 1926. There's been some kind of big change in the way that they're conceptualizing what it is to be Catholic. And it's not like the Pope all of a sudden said one day, oh, things are different now. It was a kind of just shift in common sense in the kinds of terms that it was acceptable to use and defend Catholicism that happened, I think, pretty quickly. And you can see it in lots of different sources, including and especially amongst the laity. Okay, but why? What happens in the 30s? So you'll know the 30s was this very tumultuous decade, right? Very challenging for the church. The challenge for the church in the 30s is basically the same as it is for other institutions. We can think of it as three-pronged. One challenge is economic. The Great Depression creates oceans of need in Catholic Europe, and a need that previous kinds of Catholic thinking struggles to fulfill. So basically, there's mass unemployment in Catholic Europe. The traditional Catholic response is to say, oh, well, that's why you need sort of religious charities, things like that. Religious charities are, to put it lightly, an insufficient response to the economic crisis of the 1930s. What's needed is dramatic state action, Keynesian thinking. This is an era of sort of economic modernization. Some people argue this is the era when the whole idea of the economy is born. So there's a sense in the 30s that the old Catholic solutions to material privation are no longer any good. There's also, of course, a political challenge. Catholics had, in most places in Europe at least, clustered into Catholic parties that pretty much operated to defend the interests of the church, to keep Catholic schools open, things like that. In response to the Depression, as you might probably know, there is pretty intense polarization amongst European voters who tend to flee that kind of centrist and pragmatic party towards extremes of either fascism or communism. So just as Catholic charities can't meet new economic needs, the pragmatic Catholic parties of the past can't survive or protect their flock in this new political climate either. So Catholic institutions and theories are in trouble. Combined with this, Catholics are very attentive to what's the real innovation of the 30s, which is the rise of energetic state-building projects that are using new means to control society, using mass violence if necessary. Now, historians of this period now tend to see very different sorts of leaders like Roosevelt, Hitler, and Stalin responding in some genetically similar way to those challenges, all of which involve massive expansions of state power. Now, this all makes Catholics very nervous. They've been, since the French Revolution, Catholics have been very nervous about the expansion of state power, because almost always that new state power was used against them. And here, they're even more nervous. They have even more reason to be nervous. There's the invention of a new concept called totalitarianism, which is basically the idea that the political or state project could become so powerful that it wouldn't just control your external lives, but control your actual soul. And this, for Catholics, is the scariest thing of all. So there's a number of very profound challenges facing the church in the 30s. In response to these challenges, Catholics start to ask themselves a new question. The old question was, how can we overturn modernity? And that seems now like a total non-starter. Catholics think that if they keep hammering away at it, the church will be swept away by forces it hasn't even tried to control. And this is something that's so interesting that even into the 1920s, to take a place like France, lots of Catholics will say, oh, we need to return to the monarchy. In the 1930s, when France is debated, there's communists around and socialists and fascists and all these things, to sort of cry into the wilderness that we need the monarchy, it makes no sense. There's zero chance of that happening. It has left the space of political possibility, and Catholics think they have to start asking a new question. The new question is, how can we shape a Catholic form of modernity? In other words, an anti-totalitarian form of modernity that will allow the church to survive. So that's one of my big theses, is that in the 30s we can see a shift from an anti-modern church to an anti-totalitarian church. Now there are two major options that Catholics opened up for themselves in this new period. Neither of them are liberal democratic. Even if Catholics were temperamentally inclined in such a direction, which they were not, the 1930s in Europe were neither the time nor the place for such a belief. Catholics, like many others, basically agreed that the era of liberal democracy had come to a close. They agreed that the real options for Europe are some form of authoritarian fascism or some form of socialism. They also agree that neither of these are really Catholic in any meaningful sense. The question is, which one is worse? Should we hitch ourselves to anti-communism, or should we hitch ourselves to anti-fascism? I think this is actually really important to think about these as anti-communist and anti-fascist rather than communist and fascist, because there's been so much attention paid to like how many Catholics supported Hitler, which a lot of them did. It's a very sad chapter in the history of the church. But if you go back and look at, there's been so much historical attention paid to proving the fact of that, which is itself important, because for a long time Catholics wanted to deny that. But it's true, lots of Catholics supported Hitler. But if we move past the brute fact of its existence and ask why, what was going on in their heads, very few Catholics were like, oh, Nazism is a great Catholic thing. I mean, Hitler is actually a Catholic, and so you might expect to see lots of Catholics saying, look, this is a Catholic gift to Germany. You don't see that. What you see is Hitler is a dangerous guy, Nazism is a dangerous thing, but it's better than communism, and it'll at least keep the church doors open. So it's this kind of hedging of bets that I think really defines this period in Catholic Europe. Okay, so these are the kind of options that are on the table. I'm going to talk about each of them in turn. This is what I'll talk about here. This is going to be, as you might guess, the mainstream response. In some ways, the biggest story of this whole period is that many Catholics decide, really for the first time, that the anti-communist struggle is the defining struggle of our times, and that almost any compromise can be legitimated in its name. This leads Catholics into a series of alliances with authoritarian or fascist rulers, all of whom promised to combat communism. I'm thinking most prominently of Hitler and Mussolini, of course, but there are lots of other examples from across Europe. So it's not like before 1929, Catholics were, very supportive of communism, like transparently they were not. But the difference is that before the 30s, the Catholic opposition to communism was part of a Catholic opposition to everything, to modernity as such. They lumped Catholicism or communism in with liberalism and socialism and nationalism and all these other things that they saw as modern heretical sins. Now, I think really for the first time, they're saying, no, communism is actually Satan incarnate. And these other things, well, we can work with those. I think that's the thing that changes in the early 30s. Okay. So what kind of modern Catholicism did Catholics mobilize? As I said, this has not been asked that much to sort of figure out why Catholics made the decisions they did, or how they at least defended them to themselves. And if we look, as I did, it turns out that Catholics had to, I think, become modern in order to support fascism. Fascism is itself very modern. Fascism is a very modernizing kind of political doctrine. And so if Catholics are going to support that, I think they had to make a pretty big transformation amongst themselves about what it means to be Catholic. Now, what they do, and one of the things that's really interesting is I saw they start to use a new language of things like human rights and religious freedom. The most modern kinds of political language. We can see it in the 30s, and we can see it as a strategy Catholics are using to negotiate with fascist regimes and to carve out a space where the church can survive inside these regimes. Because what Catholics had to do was say, okay, we accept that a truly Catholic society is off the table. We're not going to get that. It's done. So we're going to do our best to work with secular nationalists and Protestants against communism, and we're going to mobilize a modern language to get what we want. But they are still Catholic. They can't make the Protestant claim that religion lives in the individual soul and doesn't need public expression. They don't retreat to the individual soul. Instead, they reformulate the nature of the church's public mission in a modern way. So to go back to the model we talked about before, the first question to ask is, so how did they conceptualize the private sphere? In other words, how did they conceptualize the space in which religion is allowed to live? And if you're trying to make peace with secular nation states in the 1930s, there's really only one part of the social Catholic inheritance that merges almost seamlessly with the biopolitical needs of those states. And that's why they interpret the private sphere as a space for reproductive families. In other words, the sphere in which religious authority had unquestioned jurisdiction was the family, defined as a working father, stay-at-home mother, everyone following religious laws in their sexual lives, and having, almost by necessity, a big brood of children. If we can't have it all, they reasoned, we may as well have the family. Now, pragmatically, the state usually has very little problem with this, because nationalist leaders like this. They like the fact that the church is incentivizing births. I mean, they're trying to increase the birth rates for sort of pagan reasons of their own. They have their own reasons to oppose homosexuality and abortion. And conceptually, too, it's a good deal for the church, because the family, as we know, is a really important site of moral education. Protecting the family is a good way to ensure that the institution of the church will be able to reproduce itself, even in very dangerous times. So let's look at the kinds of public interventions that can be authorized by this understanding of the family. What we'll see in each case is that Catholic institutions are abandoned, and Catholics begin supporting secular alternatives so long as they support the family. Now, I don't want to go through this in too much detail, but the gist is that Catholics are really, for the first time, defending secular welfare states instead of sort of Catholic charities. They're supporting corporatist economics. Basically, this is like the kind of economics that fascists were into. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if you like. And they're supporting secular states so long as they agree to oppose communism. And this is where we get this idea of the defense of the West. This is really the birth of this idea of the West as a kind of inheritance that's not only Catholic, but includes Protestants and nationalists and basically everybody who kind of likes Roman columns and is not a communist. This idea, I mean, we're not very used to this idea, but it's really an innovation of this period. Okay, so what I want to sum up here is that I know this all seems like very 1930s, very old, but actually this is very new and very similar to, I think, mainstream kinds of Catholicism throughout the 20th century. The 30s is the first time you get a Catholic social ethics molded around the family, anti-communism and the state embedded in the cultural community of the West. You get a Catholicism that makes its peace really for the first time with a secular state. This way of thinking becomes totally not commonsensical across the archive of the European Church. Popes and bishops think this way, and anonymous editorialists in regional newspapers think this way too. This model helps us to explain the level of Catholic support for secular nationalist regimes, and it helps to explain why Catholic protest was so minimal, because the new regimes are actually pretty good at meeting these demands. Now, this was never the only choice. The church is a site of endless conflict, and another group made a different choice. So now I'll talk now about kind of their opponents in the 30s. Every move ever made in the history of the Catholic Church has a lot of opponents, and this one is no different. There was a network of anti-fascist Catholics who refused to take the anti-communist struggle as paramount and who urged alliances with socialists and other anti-fascist forces. For them, the struggle against racism and against state power, not against communism, was the secret truth of the age. These are the kinds of people who entered the resistance and risked their lives to fight fascism. Some of them fled into exile in the United States or elsewhere. These are the people who will hold on to the promise of Christianity as something that might never compromise with evil for any reason. So how are they thinking about Catholicism? Again, too, this is sometimes we know there's stories, or stories are told. They're often heroic and interesting stories, but how are they understanding their faith? Once I figured out what was going on in the mainstream and came to the text of these people, I was surprised. It immediately struck me that the anti-fascist Catholics were comparatively uninterested in the family. It's not like they're not attacking the reproductive family, right? They aren't supporting abortion. This is not a fan club for, drag queen story hour or something like this. They just aren't talking about it very much. They are at one with the long tradition in saying that family ethics are one part of a much broader Catholic grappling with social problems. Moreover, they point out the possible pitfalls of a family-focused Catholicism. These people actually start saying it's the marriage, not the family. They're really, insofar as they're interested in the family, they're interested in horizontal bonds of marriage and sexuality more than they are in vertical bonds of reproduction. And moreover, when we forget that, they say Christ has and this is actually, I think, I recently taught a class in the Gospels, and this seems quite true to me. What Christ has is a doctrine of marriage, not a doctrine of reproduction. And if we forget that, if we think that what Catholic ethics are about is about reproduction, we fall right into the arms of the fascists, who desire birth rate increases for their own pagan nationalist reasons. So, what kind of alternative Catholic modernism do they create? How do they imagine the private sphere if it's not going to be the reproductive family? The answer is something closer to what we call civil society. They're really interested in all the different kinds of organizations that Catholics might create. Things like youth groups, trade unions, stuff like that. And a lot of times the people who have these kinds of ideas emerge from these sorts of civil society organizations, or what at the time was often called Catholic Action. And this is not about sort of political parties or Catholic self-defense. What they're imagining is a social world governed by interfaith religious organizations. Their scale of thinking tends to be the city rather than the nation state. Their vision doesn't actually include the state that much at all. So a lot of these people are quite interested in anarchism. Some of these people come to the United States and get in touch with Saul Alinsky and folks like that. So go a little bit more into this and see what this looks like using this model. Again here, I don't want to go through all of it, but the gist here, it's a very different social model that they produce. Whereas mainstream Catholics at the time were saying, in the name of anti-communism, we should imagine a Catholic ethics focused around the family, which would allow us to defend a secular welfare state and an anti-communist kind of militarized state. The anti-fascist Catholics are saying, no, we need to organize society around Catholic civil society, around a kind of autonomous network of Catholic institutions, largely lay-led, and that this can be our social fabric, that multi-faith civic organizations can handle things like welfare, that the economy, instead of being governed from above by the state, should be governed mainly by trade unions. And that when we think about citizenship, we should be thinking not about militarized defense of the West, but about pluralism on the domestic and municipal level. So, if most Catholics of the 30s are learning to orient to new politics around the family, the dissident anti-fascists are creating a different kind of model, one that's much less capitalist and one that's much less concerned with reproduction. One in which civil society itself is the locus of Catholic politics, in which the role of the state is to allow that society to flourish. Now, this vision is perfectly modern, and that these people want other faiths to do this too. It's not an ideal of a Catholic society. It's an ideal of a good society in which Catholics play a role along with other faiths. But it's much harder to assimilate into the politics of modern statehood. Now, this doesn't have much impact in the 30s, when pretty much every Catholic stronghold falls to fascism. But it was gathering strength. It had a lot of supporters, including amongst elite theologians and some church leaders, but more importantly, amongst politicians and trade unionists and civil society activists. Just a couple of examples. You may have heard of the worker priests. These are these priests, mainly in France and Belgium, who go into the factories and start working alongside the flock, the proletariat. Some of them become socialists and communists in the process because they say, look, from the ground, this is the only path to salvation, is through socialism. This takes some political form during the resistance and after the war, when Catholics and communists are working together in quite surprising ways in the foxholes of the resistance, and then right after the war, when sort of political institutions are still, it's not clear what they're going to be, Catholics and communists are working together in quite surprising and interesting ways. And there are a couple of famous figures emerged from here, and Dorothy Day is one that you might know about, who is in these networks. The most famous globally is a figure named Jacques Maritain, who I put up here just because some of you may have heard of him and might help you locate what I'm talking about. But he's probably the most famous Catholic thinker of the 40s and 50s. He becomes the French ambassador to the Vatican. Pope Paul VI actually is a close friend of his. And so there's a moment at which it looks like this kind of anti-fascism might, in the end, conquer the church. This kind of Catholic modernism might define what it means to be Catholic in a modern world. But it does not. Something else happens called the Cold War. Because the Second World War didn't give way to a long peace in which Catholics and communists and liberals learned to get along. For a few years, that looked possible. But by the end of the 40s, it wasn't, as the Cold War emerged organically from the wreckage of World War II. And this, I think, really matters if we're going to understand the shape of the modern Catholic Church. Now, the first thing to point out, especially for those of you who are not super familiar with this period, is that Catholics emerged, at least in Europe, from the Second World War with unprecedented political power and moral authority. This requires a quite concerted and America-backed effort in whitewashing history, which I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. Politically, it takes the form of Christian democracy. This is a new set of political parties dominated in every case by Catholics that win almost every election held in Europe in the 1940s. They come to power in Italy, West Germany, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and France. Pretty much everywhere. Pretty much everywhere in Europe that is not either communist or one of the dictatorships down here is governed by Christian Democrats in the late 40s. This is a new political party led by Catholics. But, and by the way, I should say, and it's hardly understood. It's that Christian democracy, if this were a room of historians, and I started talking about Christian democracy, your eyes would all glaze over. It's kind of like centrist political parties. But if you think more broadly, it's really interesting because what it is, it's the vehicle that finally, after centuries of trouble, brings Catholics into the political mainstream. But what was it? What was Christian democracy? Most historians would just say, oh, this is modern Catholicism. But it's more complex than that, because Catholicism, as I tried to show, has been modern for some time by now. It's really about a clash of modernizing Catholic visions. So the question isn't, oh, good, this is modern Catholicism at last. It's what kind of modern Catholicism? And we can use the model we set up earlier to reprise the debate, which proceeds along quite predictable lines. The first big question is, who is the enemy? Now, one of the great truths of the post-45 Atlantic world is that even if communism and fascism as such are off the table for Western Europe and Central Europe, anti-communism and anti-fascism aren't. These are both extremely generative political ideologies in their own right, and they clash in all sorts of places, even after the war and even inside the Catholic Church. A lot of anti-fascist Catholics are saying, wait, the struggle against fascism is not over. We need a socialist awakening to continue the fight of the resistance. This is also the communist line. But by 49, those voices have been almost completely silenced. That's the year that Pope Pius XII excommunicates all Communist Party members. And Christian Democrats become defined by anti-communism. They're the most reliable partners of the Americans in the Cold War. They are not interested in trawling through the agonizing memory of fascism or racism. They prefer to imagine that the communists have been the bad guys all along and that the church had perfectly clean hands. Now, this question, as I hope I've shown by now, is related to others. Most importantly, how should we render the private sphere? Anti-fascists in the 40s are trying very hard to get Christian Democrats to commit to some version of what I showed before. And to stop harping so much on the family. The number one sort of concrete thing is to say, we should give lots of power to trade unions. But they fail. Christian Democrats instead define themselves as the party of the family. This is how, if you look at sort of Christian Democratic advertising and policy making, that's what they say. We are the party of the family against communism. We defend the family. That's how they define their role in the political system. And this has a lot of results when it comes to actual policy making. and this is some of the kind of most boring parts of my book, so I can go this very quickly. But basically what I want to say is that Christian Democrats govern in ways and talk in ways that are very continuous with the kind of mainstream family-supporting Catholics of the 30s, the same people who had supported the fascists. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's actually quite a broad continuity in Catholic thinking across the war, where in the 1930s, mainstream Catholics, most Catholics say, oh my gosh, we're living in this new authoritarian fascist world. We need to redefine Catholicism in a way that centers the family and then says, for the public sphere, the goal is just to get the state and the economy to support the family too. And so they say for the first time, we can support welfare states, we can support secular states, things like that. You see the same logic, often from the same people, reiterated after the war in the support of Christian democracy instead of support of fascism. Okay. All right. So this is the story of Catholicism in the long 50s after the Second World War. And I'm focusing here on Europe, but you can see similar things in the US. This is the era of Joseph McCarthy, a good Midwestern Catholic defined by anti-communism. This is an era when Catholics are learning to be good Americans, when a Catholic is at last becoming president. It's an era when that good Catholic, John F. Kennedy, is propping up another good Catholic to be the dictator of South Vietnam and the leader in the global struggle against communism. Now, I don't want to say that's the only story. You can still see the more anti-fascist Catholics around. I already mentioned Dorothy Day. But they remain marginal. One of the stories of the church I'm really trying to overturn is that there were these kind of good guys who fought against the Nazis during the 30s, and after the war, they kind of win. I think it's actually a more troubling story where there were a lot of good Catholics who fight against Nazis in the 30s. They're in the minority, and they remain in the minority still after World War II. But why is that? It's not because Catholics are evil. There are structural reasons why this is true. One big reason is that their vision, like that of the early Christians they venerated, was difficult to scale and difficult to cohere with the realities of governing large societies and advanced economies. The second is that they happened to be living through a moment of conservatism, Cold War, and red baiting. So much of the anti-fascist quest had been to find a Catholic reading of Marx. In the 1950s, this is like new Coke. Nobody wants this. There could be no less desired intellectual product than that in the 1950s. So there are structural reasons why the anti-fascist Catholics kind of fall apart in the global 50s. Okay, now I want to wrap up and talk a little bit about more recent times. For a historian, the last 60 years counts as more recent times. So I want to, So let's go back and think about the two moments I began with. And I think that after the analysis we've just done, we're a little better prepared to understand what these stories are about. So the first of Humanae Vitae, the kind of anti-contraception encyclical. Let's locate this a little more clearly in the global 60s. This is the story, of course, of Vatican II, from 1962 to 65, a moment when it became really clear that the church would have to change. And again, as in the 30s, there's a lot of debate over what form this would take. Normally, this period is talked about as one of sort of great revolutionary change. In a lot of ways, it was. The introduction of vernacular, things like that. But in a lot of ways, I think what Vatican II and the whole 60s doctrinal moment does is consolidate things that have already become de facto true inside the church. Things like supporting religious freedom, supporting civil rights for Jews, things like that. Catholics already, at least in Europe, already had come to those positions, and Vatican II pretty much ratifies it. And so what's interesting is that the logic of mainstream Catholicism we just saw, in which basically the state and the economy are allowed to become basically secular, while the family and sex become increasingly centralized, that logic reproduces itself in the 60s. Because a lot of what Vatican II is about is saying, oh, now we support religious freedom. If you look at the economic doctrine of the Vatican II texts, they basically support growth, private property, development, and things like that. The key words of 1960s global capitalism. But when it comes to sex, they say no. Here is where we draw the line. We will not change, we will not modernize. So I think that Humanae Vitae in the context of Vatican II really fits the story as I've been talking about. And this logic reigned, I think, during the long papacy of John Paul II. Now, John Paul, this is the Pope of my youth. John Paul gave mixed signals about the economy, and in certain moods was a great supporter of social justice. But in the end, his two most strident and firm commitments are family values and anti-communism. He's firmly in the mainstream in this regard. And I should say, in the mainstream as it's existed since the 30s. A pope like John Paul would have made no sense in the 1880s. He's really a product of this mid-century moment. Now, it's too early to say what will happen with the election of Francis. He does come from a somewhat different tradition, but I think that his experiences with Peronism in the 50s and 60s and his attempts to find the modus vivendi with the military junta of Argentina in the 70s actually bears some similarity with what I've talked about in the European case. But he has evolved a great deal since then, and at moments it's definitely seemed like he wants to revive the more anti-fascist aspects of the tradition I've been talking about. He's been extremely critical of capitalism and the ways in which it's tied to climate change. He's asked Catholics to place refugee care, elder care, and inequality at the heart of their mission. And he's also, most importantly for me, given interviews in which he explicitly says the church has focused too much on homosexuality and abortion to the detriment of more pressing global issues. And yet, as in the 60s, the church itself is heavily divided. On the one hand, lots of Catholics in practice don't follow church rules. Many church leaders, especially in Germany and Brazil, are pushing Francis to adopt more radical views about divorce and female ordination. And on the other hand, pro-family Catholics, often in places like Eastern Europe and Africa, are adopting the opposite strategy. It's been hard to know where exactly Francis will fall. His heart always seemed to be with the former group, which explains why so many conservative Catholics in America, including some bishops, have basically flouted him. And yet the decision in Brazil casts this into doubt. Essentially, he said he'd be the pope of refugees and climate change, and he would use his position to exhort people to do more for the planet. But when it came to the reform of the gendered hierarchies of the church, he would be, like his predecessors, unwilling to bend. But still, you hear him closing up, things can change. If there's one lesson I want you to take away from this long story I've been telling, it's that the church only pretends to be a granite and unchanging institution. It might be that the church is built on the rock of Peter, but rocks aren't as stable these days as they used to be. And it might be that the church is the bride of Christ, but marriages aren't that stable either. The church has actually changed an enormous amount in the past century, and it's changed quickly. There are 1 billion Catholics in the world, 1 billion people who are looking for moral guidance from an institution that they're helping to create. And that's just as molten and malleable as everything else on this Vale of Tears. The settlement we're familiar with, that we live with, liberal states, religious freedom, and all that, it's actually pretty new. And it's being tested right now. And there's really no telling what the next century will bring. The only thing that's pretty certain, though, is that Catholics will be there, continuing the story I've told today and shaping the world we all share. Thanks. So there's a good time for Q&A, right? Something that maybe didn't come through the way it could have is that Catholic anxiety about persecution is rooted in reality. Catholics were often persecuted, especially in a place like Germany, where during the Kulturkampf, Catholics were seen as these kind of anti-Germans, and that they had a lot of work to do to convince people that they were good German citizens. And so the debate that he's talking about is that the Center Party, which is the Catholic Party of Germany, in March of 1933 does lend its support to Hitler, as is known as the Enabling Act, which is what, basically it's the Catholic decision to support Hitler in the Reichstag that gives him the legal basis he needs to declare his dictatorship. And there's been a ton of debate about why the Center Party does this. And the question would be, are they doing it in order to keep persecution from happening? Or are they doing it for some other reason, like they are, committed Nazis or something like that? And I guess my response would be, based on what I've seen in the sources, it's that an important thing to note here is that only like a year or two before, Catholics had been forbidden from joining the Nazi Party. Catholics in Germany are quite aware that Nazism is like a bad thing and that it's this pagan thing. Hitler surrounds himself with all these people who are talking about these kind of Norse gods and things like that. But I think what happens is that in 1932-33, when it looks like the communists are on the verge of actually coming to power, something people forget is that when Hitler finally takes power, and, there are like a billion elections in Germany in 31, 32, 33, Hitler's party was in decline when he actually seized power. And so I think Catholics could see, oh my gosh, this is the moment when communists actually could come to power. And so that's the way I think they defended it to themselves anyway, was to say, this is the way to keep church doors open. Because one thing that, if you look at Catholic periodicals in 32, 33, they're obsessed with the crimes of the Soviet Union against the church. There are all these kind of lurid articles about priests being killed and all this stuff. And so they have some evidence to believe that they actually are in moral danger. And the idea from the Catholic perspective would be, well, Hitler he does seem like a bad guy, but he is promising to respect the churches, to keep doors open, allow us to keep delivering the sacraments. And so in this particular moment of historical crisis, in order to stave off persecution and keep doors open, that's what we'll do. To stick with the German case, so the question is sort of, I am interested in a kind of polemical sense in drawing this continuity between the fascist and Christian democratic eras, but that can only go so far. I mean, it's true, Christian democracy is not fascism. There are some major differences between them. They have very different kind of policy outcomes. Christian Democrats are respectful of Jews and things like this. So this does have some concrete policy results. So for instance, take the German case. What you can't really do anymore in Germany after the war, this is not true in France. In France, Catholics can still be, the term of art is kind of natalist. They can still really support births and say, basically, if you have a baby, we'll give you a lot of money. In Germany, you can't do that anymore because that sounds fascist. It is fascist. And so in Germany, even though Konrad Adenauer, who is the leader of Germany no one knows about Konrad Adenauer, but he leads Germany for longer than Hitler does. And he uses some of this kind of scary language about sort of depopulation and things like that, but his government can't give actual sort of Kindergeld or child allowances. At least they have to give very small ones because it seems so fascist. And so they come up with other ways to kind of support the family that don't seem like they're so like eugenic and populationist. So things like, discounted, in Germany at least, a lot of times it's pretty small bore stuff, like discounted train tickets for big families, things like that. So there are some ways in which the fascist inheritance does change what's possible. What do I want to say about that? And another thing you can see is that a lot of the family things that Catholics are committed to in the 30s are what looked to us just like straight up eugenics. Like, you have to have interviews with the state and the priest to make sure that you're sort of compatible for birth and will give good offspring for the nation or something like that. Catholics stopped talking that way after 1945. That kind of racial thinking, which was present in Catholicism in the 30s, is off the table after the war. So yeah, I don't want to draw too clear of a line between the two. So there was the first question was about, and jump in if I'm remembering these questions wrongly, but the first question is about sort of modernist anti-modernism, and this is one thing I was getting at when I was talking about the kind of complexities of modernism or modern as a term, because a lot of times people who pretend to be anti-modern really are super modern. There's a book about Nazism called Reactionary Modernism that makes a similar kind of point. And especially when you get into the aesthetic realm, it's even more confusing because a lot of what claims to be modernist art is actually, they're really obsessed with the medievals. And they're really obsessed with kind of iconography and with Byzantine art and all these kind of things that get beyond kind of perspectival heresies of modern art. And so I guess one thing I would say is that is definitely going on inside Catholicism, especially in the 1920s. There are, or the teens and 20s, lots of sort of modernist artists. People like T.S. Eliot kind of flirt with Catholicism because it seems like a kind of anti-modern modernism par excellence. And I guess for me, I think I would say that in a lot of cases, that kind of modern, anti-modern thinking is tied to a really deep criticism of kind of bourgeois modernity in the sense that there's something kind of spiritually unsatisfying about it, which is why so many of these people, kind of including Eliot, become fascists. And so I guess that's why it was important to me to think about it as, to use the term more as it's been used in kind of religious studies or secularism studies, more than it's been used in kind of aesthetic circles. I think it has somewhat different valences, and because, yeah, the aesthetic kind of modern, anti-modern stuff is so, it gets so heady and confusing. And I think also is less helpful to understand kind of the realities of sort of social policy, which is what your other questions were about. The second one was about, what was the second one? Oh, yeah. Right. Okay, so yeah, good. Yeah, good. And so this term corporatism is another one like modern or modernity that gets thrown around so much. It can mean so many different things. Basically what it means is it's a social or an economic vision in which instead of, the kind of doctrinaire free market capitalist vision would be, I'm an individual, an atomized individual consumer faced with a free market, and that's where all decisions about wages and prices are made in that free market, and I sort of encounter this market as a kind of monad. The corporatist ideal is that I'm not an individual consumer, I'm part of a kind of consumers collective. And I'm not an individual worker, I'm part of a trade union. And it tries to imagine the economy as made up of kind of bodies of different kind of economic actors, and to allow economic decisions to be made by kind of rational discussion amongst those actors instead of allowing the free market to set things willy-nilly. This, in some form, this is a very old Catholic idea. If you look at sort of 19th century Catholic economic doctrine, it's something like this. And basically their vision is we'll have Catholic employers syndicates overseen by a priest and Catholic workers syndicates also overseen by a priest. And together they will arrive at things like wage and price levels in the interest of the common good. This is, seems like quite a utopian vision, but in the 19th century this made some sense. And actually there were some small bore experiments in making that a reality. What changes in the 30s is the kind of corporatism that someone like Mussolini or Hitler are interested in, and fascists do use this word. And it's something that gets a lot of Catholics. One of the things that makes them say, oh, they kind of have a similar ideal as us. But in practice, fascist corporatism was always about the state having pretty much absolute control. This took lots of different forms, but to take one case, the one that Catholics were most excited about was the Austrian case, which there was a kind of Catholic dictator sort of setting this up with the help of all sorts of Catholic economists and so on. But when push came to shove, and so they had worker syndicates and all that kind of thing, but it was the state who was appointing everybody. And so where the Catholic vision was kind of like a bottom-up and clergy-controlled process, the fascist vision is one where in the end the state has the power. And this was what, a lot of Italian Catholics get very disappointed by this. And so in Mussolini's early economic vision, it actually does look pretty Catholic. But then as it gets into the 30s, it clearly is not. This kind of corporatist vision does survive into the 40s and 50s, and it's something that, interestingly, we actually really celebrate about European capitalism after the war, is that they gave a lot more power to trade unions than was the case in the United States. There actually was, especially in Austria, but other places too, kind of where sites, government sort of sponsored but not run sites, where employer syndicates and trade unions would kind of come together and try to make some decisions about things like wage and price levels. I guess the big difference you see between the 30s vision of this and then the 40s Christian democratic vision has to do with the constitution of the labor element, where in the fascist order, both in France, Germany, and Austria, in fact, they all developed forms of this where the trade union representatives are all selected by the state. Whereas in the Christian democratic vision, the trade unions have a kind of legal separation from the state, and they're allowed to appoint their own representatives. So that's the biggest kind of structural shift. I think it's a pretty similar kind of vision about not letting the free market make these decisions, but in terms of the details in the Christian democratic version, it looks quite different. So in that sense, it's similar to the family policy thing I talked about earlier. And then the third question was about the Kirchensteuer, so basically in Germany especially, there are still, in a sense, are established churches where a lot of your tax money will go to a state church. And what is interesting is that this is really kept up after the war. And, it's been a while since I've looked at this, but my sense is that it wasn't even all that controversial. Because one of the things that happens is that, what do I want to say? The idea of Germany as a Christian nation becomes really important after the war, whereas Germans want to say, and American occupiers too, because you might expect, you mentioned this, you might expect that American occupiers would want to kind of export American ideals of separation of church and state into Germany, but they very much don't. If you look, I looked at the archives of the occupying Americans, and they think the churches are great. They think, wrongly, but they think that the churches were like the great bulwark against Nazism. They think this for their own reasons, having to do with their own understanding of Christianity coming from America. But they really want to defend and support the churches after World War II. So things like the traditional church tax, which you might think would be abolished when West Germany became a kind of more Atlantic-facing state, really aren't. And I think the reason has to do with the kind of moral authority that the churches have after the war. Yep.
I'm having trouble framing it as a question, but when you're mentioning,
Sure.
now I'm thinking about one of the other outcomes being the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so where that's all played between Poland's attitudes for it, which are negative, or even Hungarian attitudes, which aren't quite, I can't put something in the Catholic camp, but how does it fit into this whole larger thesis about, so the Polish attitude is a bulwark of sort of anti-capitalism values, or anti-Catholic values, right now.
You mean you're talking about the present moment.
Itself and the rules it's putting in place. So is there anything about the shape or development of the European Union to think about?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the book talks a lot about kind of the early, there was no such thing really as a European Union until the 90s, but there are, of course, all sorts of various kinds of, like the European Coal and Steel Commission, things like that. And a lot of the founding fathers of this are Catholic. And it's not hard, and a lot of the early meetings of what would become the EU are held kind of in cathedral spaces. And there's this big playing up of the kind of Western Catholic heritage of these countries. It's interesting in terms of Brexit, is that, I think that Brexit was often misinterpreted in the United States as people were like, oh my gosh, this is the end of the post-war settlement. I mean, Britain was always a pretty unhappy member of Europe, and after World War II doesn't want to be involved with basically these squabbling European nations. Basically, from the British perspective, what became the EU was a bunch of sort of squabbling papists, and they had no desire to be a part of it. So I think the early EU really is a kind of Catholic project. And there's a way in which, so my story kind of goes into the 60s, and I think to really answer your question about what's going on now, we have to understand better than I do what kind of happens both to Catholicism and to Christian democracy after, let's say, 1970. Because up until the kind of mid-60s, these kind of Catholic-led Christian democratic parties are really important in Europe, and also in what would become the EU, and then they kind of fall apart. There's something that happens in European Christianity in the late 60s that historians are still kind of, I think, grappling to understand. We now think about Europe as basically a secular place compared to our sort of very pious Christian nation. But that's a pretty recent phenomenon. The idea that you go to Germany and all the churches are empty on a Sunday, that's pretty recent. I mean, it's really in the 60s that Europeans stopped going to church. And that's a question that I don't ask, that I don't know the answer to, but that has lots of political ramifications. And so Christian democratic parties, instead of being robustly Catholic parties, become basically kind of centrist business parties, as does the European People's Party, the EPP, which is their representative in the European Parliament. So something happens with the EU where it comes to be seen as kind of a Brussels bureaucratic phenomenon instead of like a Roman spiritual phenomenon that would have to explain what's going on now. But as to why that happened, I'm not sure.
Anyone else? Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.